I would simply wrap up this message with you today by telling you a story from my own life, and maybe you can find something in that story that might encourage you this week to look for those in your midst that perhaps instead of pushing to the margins, we need to lift up a little bit. Earlier in my career, I was a youth pastor. And I didn't really set out to be a youth pastor, but it kind of worked out, and that's the direction that God had me for a number of years. And so I started off my career in youth ministry working in a fairly large suburban church that had a typical mix of suburban kids. They were fairly bright kids. They were from upper middle class families. They were, for the most part, fairly well-behaved kids and things like that. But as our ministry began to grow and as God blessed it, we began to attract all sorts of other kids into our ministry. And there was this one kid, we'll call him George. George was a handful. George was the kind of kid that was probably just as likely to spray graffiti on the church walls as he was to come inside of them and attend a worship service. George had a lot of issues and a lot of problems, and he was the kind of kid that quite frankly, when you saw him coming, your first instinct was duck or run the other way or something like that. He was a handful. Well, I had a bright idea, being young and in my ministry and not always necessarily thinking things through very well. So I had this bright idea one year during the season of Lent, leading up to Easter Sunday, to every Sunday have a different teenager speak in the main worship service. We called it the KIR moment, or the Keeping It Real moment, to just talk about what God was doing in their lives. And it was pretty powerful stuff. So week after week, I'd selected a different student. And these, I'll be honest with you, for the most part, were kind of model students in the ministry, if you will. They would present well. I would ask them if they wanted to speak. They would carefully prepare what they were going to say, and they would get up and they would talk about how God was moving in their lives and that sort of stuff. And it was kind of powerful. So we kind of inched along Sunday after Sunday as we got toward Easter. And it was getting close to Easter, and I realized I haven't selected a student to speak on Easter Sunday yet. Now, you're a Christian, you've been in church probably for a long time, you know that Easter is the Super Bowl. It is prime time, if you will. And Easter is the Sunday that we often add extra services, and there's special things going on, and it's literally standing room only, and that sort of thing. And so for whatever reason, I decided to ask George if he would like to speak on Easter Sunday during one of these KIR moments. And so I go up to him one day and I say, George, hey, we have one last KIR moment. It's going to be on Easter Sunday. I'd like it if you would consider doing it. Well, he didn't hesitate. He said, sure, I'll do it. And that was it. That was maybe a couple of weeks or so before Easter. Well, we get closer to Easter. I hadn't spent a lot more time about this, thinking about this, and so one day the church secretary calls me up and says, hey, we need to do the bulletin for Easter. What is the name of the student who is going to do this moment on Easter? And I told her. There was a pause, but she didn't say anything. She hung up the phone. 3 or 4 minutes later, my phone rang. It was the associate pastor. I said, hey, I was just looking over the bulletin. I noticed that you'd selected George to speak on Easter Sunday. You know, maybe you might want to rethink that a little bit. Maybe that isn't just the right thing for him to do on that particular day. And we had a short conversation. We hung up the phone, and that was it. And 30 minutes later, the senior pastor called and said, hey, well, I kind of heard through the grapevine that you were going to have George speak on Easter Sunday, and let's rethink that a little bit. And by this point, I'm standing my ground. I'm saying, no, this is how it's going to be. This is the kid. He's going to speak on Easter Sunday. And so the way that they actually resolved it, I'm embarrassed to say, but the way it was resolved is that no name would go in the bulletin on Easter Sunday. It would just be blank. It would just say the Keeping It Real moment, and then there'd be a blank. And they just wouldn't put a student's name in there, hoping that perhaps something would come about that maybe that wouldn't be the case, quite frankly. Easter Sunday comes. Now, this is a large formal church. We process in with everything but the kitchen sink, and we're sitting up there on the thrones, kind of in the chancel area, and that sort of stuff. And I have already looked to my left and looked to the right for the exits from the sanctuary, just in case I had to make a quick exit from this church, because I thought it was just as likely that this kid would get up there and do a good job as it would be that he would do something incredibly inappropriate in that particular service. And so the moment comes, and all the staff and all the lay leaders and everyone who knew anything about this were all kind of holding their breath a little bit. And Jordy, of course, is sitting way at the back of the sanctuary, and he gets up and he begins to slowly make his way up to the lectern. It seemed to take forever, and so he finally gets up there, and he looks down, kind of like this, for what seems like forever. It was one of those long, pregnant pauses, to the extent I was just about to get out of my seat and go and try to do something, when he suddenly looks up and he looks at the congregation, and he tells a story that I don't think anybody will ever forget. He says, every other church in this town had given up on me, and I came here, and I've done everything I possibly can to keep you from loving me. But here I am, and he just went on to tell about his life and about where he had been and about his struggle with following Jesus and how he was coming to understand what true love really was through this church, the very church that almost didn't put him in that slot. So after he told this very powerful story, he picks up his things and he goes back to his seat, and nothing happened. There was complete stillness across the sanctuary. Nobody said a word, and the service was effectively over for that day, even though the sermon had not been preached and things had yet to happen. But Jordy had said everything that needed to be said, because what he essentially said is, you noticed me. Know always that God loves you, and so do we.